Hello, it's your friend Phil, Project Management Trainer and Coach. Today, we're going to be covering the PMBOK Guide, 6th edition, all the 49 processes for your PMP exam. Now, you know that the PMP exam did change on the 2nd of January, 2021. However, the 49 processes are still very relevant in understanding the basis for project management. So let's start from the very beginning, develop project charter, all the way to the end, close project or phase. Grab a pen and paper, and remember, you can get the electronic copy of this book right here in the comment section. Let's go. Open up page 25 in the PMBOK Guide 6th edition. We're going to be covering all the processes from top down, and we're going to be going in columns. Are you ready? Let's go. The first process group in the 49 processes is the initiating process group. In the initiating process group, this is where we strive to authorize the project with the help of the project sponsor, of course, and also to identify our stakeholders, of course, with the help of other stakeholders who we may have already pre-identified. So let's talk about initiating. Two processes here. The first process is develop project charter. In develop project charter, the project manager and the project sponsor are involved in developing a project charter that authorizes the project. The project charter is a document that authorizes the project, that identifies the project manager, that also clarifies at a very high level the scope, the risks, milestones, any constraints, but it's a very high level document. Some firms may actually make this a one-pager or a two-pager. So it's rather brief. It goes straight to the point about what the project is about, who is the project manager, what are some of the key criteria that need to be met from this project, and what are some of the high-level requirements for the project. The project charter is authorized by an entity known as the project sponsor or initiator. They sign off on the charter sometimes. In other firms, it might be an electronic charter, but this document carries a lot of weight in the world of the PMI. The next process in initiating is the identify stakeholders process. And in identify stakeholders, the project manager, along with other stakeholders, are identifying more stakeholders. What is a stakeholder? Anyone that the project could affect, and anyone who could be affected by the project, or anyone who perceives the project to be a threat to them, or maybe even an opportunity. So we talk about stakeholders who may have a negative perception of your project and those that may have a positive perception of your project. They are all stakeholders, people who could be affected or people who could affect the project, and also people who think they may be affected by the project. Such people have a high level of interest. Now let's move on to the next process group. The next process group is called planning. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. You've heard the saying before. Well, in this process group, this is where we plan all of the different facets of project management. So let's take a look here. The first process in planning is called Develop Project Management Plan. Now, to understand what we do in Develop Project Management Plan, you would need to understand everything else that I'm going to be talking about within this area. Because this first process is all about collectively summing up all of the different subsidiary plans that exist and putting them into one final, as it were, plan called the Project Management Plan. It's the big plan that summarizes everything that has to be done on the project. Within the Project Management Plan, you have several subsidiary plans. For example, a change management plan, a plan for how to manage changes on the project, a cost management plan, a plan for how to manage cost, a scope management plan, a plan for how to manage scope, a schedule management plan, a resource management plan, so on and so forth. So there are quite a number of plans here, and there are also other things we call baselines. Baselines establish what we are aiming towards on the project. We could have a scope baseline that outlines all the work to be done. We could have a schedule baseline which outlines the start and finish dates of all of the tasks and the project as a whole. And we could also have a cost management plan and a cost baseline. The cost baseline defines how we should be spending the budget incrementally through the project. So when you take a look at this process, develop project management plan, bear in mind that it is a process that assembles several outputs from other processes. So now we'll begin to talk about the tiny little things that we do throughout planning that gives us the sum total that becomes the project management plan. So let's go. Next process is called plan scope management. In this process, we come out with a plan for how to manage scope on the project. It defines the processes of scope management that will be undertaken on the project. It also gives us guidance on how scope will be defined, how it will be managed, and so on. So from plan scope management, we get the scope management plan and the requirements management plan, and that now becomes an input to collect requirements. The next process is collect requirements. This is a process that helps us collect the requirements in a structured and orderly fashion. Now, in collect requirements, we have the scope management plan as an input, but we also have a requirements management plan as an input as well. So your requirements management plan is also generated from the previous process that we just looked at called plan scope management. In collecting requirements, we're making sure that we are following the plan to elicit these requirements the right way, document them the right way, and we could come out with a document known as a requirements traceability matrix that tracks the requirements to their origin. Next process is called define scope. In define scope, this is where we are defining the work that must be accomplished to achieve the requirements that we've just identified. We come out with a document known as a project scope statement. And within the project scope statement, we have conclusions, exclusions, deliverable description, and the acceptance criteria for the project. The next process is called create WBS. WBS stands for work breakdown structure. In the create WBS process, we are creating a work breakdown structure that breaks the project work down from the top all the way down to the lowest level we call the work package level. And the work package level is a manageable component of work. And the work packages that we define in the WBS should be deliverable oriented as much as possible. After we've created the work breakdown structure, we move into schedule management. So the plan schedule management process is one in which we develop a plan for how we're going to develop the schedule. Before you develop your schedule, plan how are we going to do it? How many people are going to be involved? Which team members should be involved in the development of the schedule? What units of time should we observe? Should it be weeks, months, or days, or seconds? It really depends on your project, the nature of your project. But after we've come up with a plan for how to develop and manage the schedule, we then begin to work on the different components that will eventually give us our schedule. So the next process is called define activities. And in define activities, we are listing out all of our activities that need to be accomplished. We come out with an activity list. We also further define what these activities are. If an activity, for example, is named build structure, well, an activity attribute of build structure could further define what the structure looks like and who will be building that structure, the resources to build a structure, and so on. We refer to this additional information about activities. We refer to this as activity attributes. We also have an output from here known as a milestone list. Milestones show accomplishments on the project. They are zero duration events. That is also generated from this process known as define activities. The next process is sequence activities. This is where we put our activities in order. The next process is estimate activity durations. This is where we estimate how long each of these activities will take based on the resources that we intend to assign to the activities. Before you come out with a duration for an activity, you should have an idea of the resources that will be available to you. The next process here is called develop schedule. This is putting the entire schedule together. So all the components and processes that we've just talked about give us this sum total of information that becomes the schedule, the start and the finish dates for the activities identified, and also the start and end date for the project as a whole. The next process is moving us into cost management. This is called plan cost management. And this is where we develop a plan for how to manage cost on the project. It gives us an idea of how we will estimate the cost, how we will determine the budget, and how the cost expenditures will be controlled. The next process is known as estimate costs. This is where we come out with cost estimates for the different pieces of work. Think of it like this. You have different activities, but you have cost estimates for each of those activities. It's in this process that we put those cost estimates together. The next process is called determine budget. In determine budget, we are summing up all of those cost estimates into a final total amount called the budget. And this budget is what we work towards throughout the project. We also come out with something called a cost baseline. The cost baseline is the time-phased budget at completion. It shows us how the cost should be spent across the project timeline, but it also shows us what the sum total of all expenditures should be on the project. So we refer to that as the cost baseline. The next process here is plan quality management. Taking us into the quality knowledge area. In plan quality management, this is where we determine which quality standards need to be met on the project. ISO, ANSI, maybe an internal quality standard, whatever it is, this is where we identify that. This is where we also identify the metrics that we will be measuring our product, service, or result against, or our performance against in the world of quality. So in plan quality management, a major output from here is our quality management plan. Our next process here is taking us into the resource management knowledge area. In resource management, this is where we seek to understand how are we going to acquire the resources and how are we going to manage them throughout the life of the project. So in this first process, plan resource management, this is where you're coming up with a plan for how to acquire the resources you need. This is where you are coming out with a plan, a game plan for how to develop your people, for how to effectively lead your people, and also for how to effectively manage any resources on the project. Human, equipment, materials, supplies, they all fall under resource management. So our plan is how are we going to acquire the people? How are we going to acquire the materials? How are we going to acquire the equipment? How are we going to acquire the facilities? How are we going to acquire the supplies? How will we manage these supplies at project end if we have surplus? What are we going to do? So it's an end-to-end plan that doesn't just focus on the human aspects, but it also focuses on the equipment, the materials, the supplies, the physical resources. Our next process here is called estimate activity resources. And this is where we estimate the resources needed to complete the project. How many people? How much equipment? How many supplies? What kind of facility? What should the facility be able to accommodate? And so on and so forth. Our next process here is plan communications management, taking us into communications. In communications management, this is where we are planning how to communicate and actually carrying out the communications. But in this first process, plan communications management, we are coming out with a plan for how to communicate, what to communicate, why are we communicating this, when are we communicating this, who's responsible. Our next process here is taking us into risk management. It's called plan risk management. This is where you plan how risks will be managed on the project. How far will you go to plan for the unexpected? Who are the people, the stakeholders that you will involve? How often will you carry out these risk management activities on the project? How often will you go through your risk register to identify new risks and to ensure that the risks you've already put in the register are still where you left them? In other words, the probability is still the same, the impact is still the same. All of that stuff has to be defined. Also, we need to define the definition of impact scales. So, how do you know when something is a very high risk or a very low risk or a low risk? You have to define these scales for your team so that when they give you approximations or ideas in qualitative risk analysis, the ideas will be as close to what you intend them to be. Next process here is called identify risk. This is where we begin to identify those risks. What could go wrong? What could cause that to happen? We call that the cause. What could go wrong? Think of it as the risk. And what would the effect of that event be? So we think about the cause, the risk, and the effect as we identify our risks. It's a great model that the PMI espouses. Next process here is called perform qualitative risk analysis. In our qualitative risk analysis, we seek to categorize the risks. We also seek to rank the risks. We could rank risks in a number of ways: technical risks, functional risks, business risks, maybe even organizational risks. But as you categorize the risks, we also should endeavor to rank them by using something called a risk score. Probability rating times impact rating gives you a risk score. Next process here is perform quantitative risk analysis. Now, quantitative risk analysis is a little bit different. This is where we actually use a quantitative measure such as money, currency, resource hours, or some other quantitative measure. So as you have assessed your risks qualitatively, you've ranked them, you want to take the top risks, not every single risk, but the top risks. You want to take them, you want to analyze them from a quantitative standpoint. Okay, if that risk happens, what is the quantitative effect in currency? How bad is it likely to be? And so on and so forth. So this is called quantitative risk analysis. In this process, perform quantitative risk analysis, we do not use the probability impact matrix. And I'm excluding this for those studying for the exam because oftentimes people think the P times I matrix is used here. No, it's not. As opposed to that, we use expected monetary value, which is talked about in the PMBOK guide. You also might want to look out for decision tree analysis and look out for that example in the PMBOK guide, 6th edition. Next process here is called plan risk responses. This is where we plan responses for all the risks that we've identified, or perhaps the top risks that you've identified make their way into this stage. It varies firm by firm. Some firms don't bother with the low-level risks that fall all the way down to the bottom of the watch list. They keep an eye on them, and if they become troublesome, then they do something about it. But in many firms, risk responses may not be planned for the entire array of risks. So bear that in mind. In plan risk responses, this is where you plan how to counteract the risks that you've observed. Are you going to mitigate them, transfer them, avoid them? If they're positive, are you going to share them? Are you going to enhance? So on and so forth. And there are many other strategies for risks that are talked about in the PMBOK guide. Definitely a must-read if you are taking the CAPM or the PMP exam. Next process here is plan procurement management. This is where you carry out a make or buy analysis. And this is where you decide if you need to purchase anything from outside your firm, if you need to buy, or if you are going to make it all by yourself. Another perspective is, are we going to use just the resources we have, the human resources, or do we need some staff augmentation from outside? This is where you make all those decisions. And as you carry out your make or buy analysis, you come up with a make or buy decision. And if you do decide to procure something, then you need to have a game plan for how to procure this stuff. You have to have a game plan for the type of contract to use, what the contract will look like, also the RFP, RFQ, RFI, RFN, IFN, IFB, all that stuff. It all has to be planned up front. If you don't know what all of those acronyms mean, you'll find them in the PMBOK guide. PMBOK guide 6th edition has a great place for you to look for all these acronyms, which is a great improvement. The next process here is called planned stakeholder engagement. And this is where you plan how to get your stakeholders engaged. This is where you plan how to get Phil, a disengaged stakeholder, as engaged as you really want him to be. If Phil is currently clueless, not showing up for meetings, but you would like Phil to be in a leading role to help the team better understand the project, to help his team come on board and assist in the project, then you need a game plan. So as you develop this plan for how to engage Phil and other stakeholders, the next step in the stakeholder management knowledge area will be to execute the plan and to actually get these folks engaged by carrying out your plan. Maybe it's a plan to communicate a little bit more. Maybe it's a plan to send out a report. Maybe it's a plan to have lunch with that stakeholder. Carry out the plan. Okay? So those are our processes in the planning process group. And that is the biggest process group in the entire PMBOK guide. And we just got done with that. Isn't that cool? Let's move on to our next process group. It's called the executing process group. It is a very important one. So let's talk about the executing processes one by one. The first one is called direct and manage project work. This is from the integration management knowledge area. In direct and manage project work, this is where we come out with deliverables. It's a very important one because without your deliverable, your project won't end. The deliverable is the product, service, or result that the project is all about. The next process is called manage project knowledge. Now, as knowledge is generated on projects, we should seek to share that knowledge. We should seek to document that knowledge. And in this process, this is where our game plan is being executed for how to harvest that knowledge, how to create the appropriate interactions for people generating that knowledge. And this is where we are actually sharing the knowledge with people. From this process, knowledge is generated, it's shared, and people on other projects can also benefit from the knowledge we generate from our current project in a structured fashion. The next process is called manage quality. In manage quality, we are managing the quality expectations, the quality levels on the project, and we're carrying out quality audits to really make sure people are following the plan for carrying out the quality aspects, the quality management plan, the quality tasks. We're making sure that these are being carried out as planned, that people are following the right process. This is also where we could sustain and improve on our project management processes to make sure that we are doing the right thing and we have sustained it. It's called manage quality. The next process is called acquire resources. In this process, we are actually acquiring the resources we need: human, equipment, material, supplies, so on and so forth. The next process is called develop team. In develop team, we are developing our team through training, team building, coaching, so on and so forth. Next process is called manage team. In manage team, the project manager should be involved in giving the team feedback, valuable feedback, constructive feedback that the team can take back and understand where exactly are we, how well are we doing, and how well is the project being viewed by management. And also, how can we improve on our current state on the project? Next process is called manage communications. This is where we are actually communicating. So we are generating project communications, we are sending out reports, and people are getting the information they need. The next process is called implement risk responses. This is where we are carrying out our risk response plan. Remember, we talked about the risk response plan. Well, in this process, we are actually carrying out our risk response plan. The next process is called conduct procurements. In conduct procurements, we are carrying out our plan for procurement. We are sending out RFPs, RFQs, RFIs, all of those procurement documents. We are getting responses back from sellers, potential sellers. We are getting questions. We are giving feedback to those potential sellers. And we could be carrying out a bidder conference. And we are helping the potential sellers to really understand the project. And then we receive those proposals back from them. We review the proposals, and then we award the contract to a seller or sellers. Last but not least, in execution, we have the process called managed stakeholder engagement. In this process, we are carrying out the plan. Remember, we talked about Phil, a disengaged stakeholder. How do we get him engaged? Well, we have water cooler conversations, we share reports, we do this and that. Well, this is actually where you do what you planned that you would do. Let's move on to our next process group. It's called the monitoring and controlling process group. And in the monitoring and controlling process group, this is where we check to make sure that the plan is being followed. And if it is not being followed properly, this is where we realign the project with the plan. And this is also where we could take action. We could take action to bring the project back in alignment, or we could see ahead where the project is trending towards and get the project back. For example, if you see you're tending towards massive cost expenditures in the monitoring and controlling process group, this is where you would steer the project back. You would carry out actions to bring back your cost into alignment. Also, when we talk about schedule management, in controlling the schedule, we also need to bring back the schedule into alignment. If we see we're going off and we could be late, then we need to bring it back in alignment. Same for scope. We find out that we're doing things we didn't plan to do, we need to steer the project back and stop gold plating and stop the scope creep. So let's talk about this in more detail. The first process is called monitor and control project work. This is where we are monitoring the project as a whole. And this is where we are also generating work performance reports that tell us how well we are performing on the project. And these work performance reports, after they are generated from here, needs to be distributed to the wider team. And we do that in managed communications that we just talked about. So this is a very important one because it's from here we get work performance reports. If you're taking the exam, hold on to that thought. Next process is called performing integrated change control. In performing integrated change control, there's an entity called the Change Control Board that's talked about in the PMBOK guide. In this process, the Change Control Board reviews change requests. Now, how do change requests come about? They come from stakeholders. They get sent to typically the project manager. The project manager should review those change requests along with the team, people with the right technical expertise, and come to an understanding of what exactly is the stakeholder asking for. What will it cost? What is the impact on the project likely to be? And after getting all this information, the project manager should then share the change request and the analysis of the change request with the Change Control Board. And the Change Control Board should review the change request and the analysis before making a decision as to whether to approve or reject the changes. Now, all of this information should be put into a change log when that final decision is made, and that change log should capture what the final decision was and why that decision was made. So this is a very important process. In fact, many questions on the PMP exam revolve around performing integrated change control. Next process here is called validate scope. In validate scope, this is where the customer is checking the deliverable to make sure that it really conforms to what was asked for in the original contract or the original requirements documents. It's called validate scope, exclusively where your stakeholder, most likely your customer, your end user, your sponsor, checks that deliverable to make sure it conforms to requirements. Next process here is called control scope. In control scope, the project manager is involved in controlling the project from being gold plated. What do I mean by gold plated? Gold plating is adding extras that are not requested, that are not asked for by the customer. Adding extras that were not requested. This is totally forbidden in the world of the PMI. Now, it happens in the real world, but it's not acceptable or good project management to add extras that were not planned for, that were not asked for, and that were not paid for. So you don't want your team to gold plate. This is what we do in control scope. Next one here is control schedule. In control schedule, this is where the project manager should be involved in checking the schedule, making sure that all those milestones are being hit. If milestones are coming up, the project manager should sound the alarm, help people refocus, and set the expectations that they meet those milestones if there has been any misalignment. Now, if a change in schedule has happened, the project manager should also seek to understand, why did that schedule change happen? And how can I get my project back in alignment with the original schedule? Next process here is control cost. Well, in control cost, there is a very important technique called earned value management. And this could take another 2 hours to talk about. So we won't talk about earned value here, but I would highly advise you to watch my videos on earned value management. Earned value management is a way that we keep our costs under control. In control cost at a high level, the project manager checks cost expenditures to make sure that they are indeed legitimate, to make sure that the team has not gone over budget. And if the team has gone over budget in one process or another, the project manager can look for ways of getting costs back in alignment. The project manager may be involved in moving funds around different cost centers to make sure that the project comes back into alignment with the plan. The next process here is called control quality. In control quality, the project manager is involved in checking to make sure that that deliverable, that product, service, or result meets requirements. This is where you and your team, before the customer gets the chance to, check the deliverable. This is where your team is checking the final product, service, or result to make sure that it conforms to requirements, to make sure that it's fit for use. Now, if it is fit for use, you then send that deliverable to your customer in validate scope. Control quality, I'm checking my deliverable. Validate scope, my customer is checking the deliverable. Do you get the relationship? So control quality actually happens before validate scope. Okay? Very important to remember that. If you're taking the PMP exam, that is a relationship you definitely want to put in your back pocket. Next process here is called control resources. This is where we are involved in controlling the physical resources, not the human, but the physical. This is where the human resources are excluded and we focus on the equipment, the supplies, the facilities, so on and so forth, the materials. In control resources, we need to make sure that those physical resources are being used the right way on the project. We want to make sure that they have been allocated and used as planned. So the allocation is one thing, but the use is another thing. And it's in this process that we seek to ensure that the usage is what was intended. Next process here is called monitor communications. This is where the project manager keeps an eye on the communications, makes sure that what should have been communicated was communicated, and make sure that the communications management plan is indeed working. If a stakeholder says, project manager, I'm not happy about how the communications have been flowing. I expected to get this, that, and the other communications 5 days ago. I haven't even gotten anything yet. The project manager should seek to change and correct that. Either realign the expectations with the plan, or if the plan isn't being followed, the project manager needs to ensure that the team follows the plan. Then if it wasn't followed, what are you going to do, project manager? Correct it, right? Next process is monitor risks. In monitor risks, again, we're keeping our eye on how the risk management strategies have panned out. We're trying to understand, was that a sufficient response for that risk? Did it really work? How well are we doing in our risk management? This is where you carry out some sort of risk audit to make sure that risks are where you left them. And if risks are not where you left them, you need to update the plan. We call that risk reassessment. So you want to carry out the audit to really understand, did our strategy work? And you want to carry out a reassessment to reassess the risk that you previously identified. And then you also want to identify any new risks that you haven't identified previously. So this process, monitor risks, is a loaded one. A lot of stuff happens here. Was my response good? Are there any new risks? Are the old risks where we left them? What can we do to better improve our risk approach? All that stuff happens in monitor risks. Next process is called control procurement. In control procurement, this is where the project manager should be involved in ensuring that the vendor, the seller, did what they promised in the contract. So, in my mind, I see a parallel universe of project management in the world of the seller. The seller has got their own processes they're working. It's in this process, control procurement, that I ensure what I asked for has actually been done. It's called control procurement. You are in the control mode of steering things in the right direction if they are not following the plan. Last but not least, here we have monitor stakeholder engagement. Again, you're monitoring, seeking to understand. Are we doing a really good job in our stakeholder management? Is the stakeholder glad or happy? Is the customer happy? If your stakeholder thinks you're doing a bad job, it's here that you catch that and you change that. You bring back the project into alignment with the expectations of the stakeholder. You have conversations to better understand what the stakeholder wants and to steer the project in the right direction. Because everything that we do in this entire process group should have been planned. So we are following the plan, and we are also ensuring that our team members and other stakeholders are aware of what should be done in the plan. Okay? So that's a very, very important process group. Without thorough monitoring and controlling, your project could go to the dogs. The last process group here is called the closing process group. In the closing process group, major thing that happens here, it's called close project or phase. In close project or phase, the project manager and the team should be involved in multiple closing activities. Now, there are lots of activities that happen in closing. We should seek to understand if the project has accomplished everything that was promised. Has all the work in the plan been done? Has all of the lessons, or have all of the lessons been collected? All the lessons learned. So we need to collect additional lessons learned from vendors or suppliers. This is where we should also make sure any existing claims are closed out. This is where you should also ensure that knowledge that needs to be shared is shared with everyone. This is where you want to make sure that if there are improvements that you observed could happen in your firm, maybe to be captured in organizational process assets, this is where you make sure that that information is passed on to the right people. Hey, we saw a potential improvement. Why don't you improve on these OPAs, organizational process assets, which are really processes and procedures for carrying out work in the firm. This is where you are also involved in the final archiving of any project information that can be used again. This is where you are also involved in closing out all of those cost accounts. You're also involved in managing any resources that were surplus, making sure that excess resources are handled the right way. You're also involved in taking account for why the project got shut down prematurely in some instances. So you're carrying out the analysis. You're also carrying out work to produce a final project report. So this is a loaded process. Lots of things happening here, closing out documents, finalizing reports, so on and so forth. Okay? And that concludes the 49 processes of the PMBOK Guide 6th edition. For those of you getting ready for the PMP exam, remember you can sign up for a 35 contact hour course that covers Agile, Predictive, and Hybrid. Do so at Praizion.com. That's Praizion.com. All you need to do is visit the website. On visiting the website, look for the 35 contact hour course with Agile. It's on demand. The moment you sign up for it, you get access to review all the chapters across predictive, agile, and hybrid domains. It's a fully loaded course taught by 2 expert instructors, and there are lots of options there, right there on the Praizion.com site. Thank you for joining me. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.